Okay, wonderful. So I'm Sandeep Chakrabarti. I'm a faculty here at IIMA, and on behalf of the Research and Publications Committee here at IIMA, I would like to welcome all of you to today's Research and Publications seminar. Today's speaker is Professor Vishal Gupta, and he's going to talk about his study on geographical dissimilarity and team member influence. And they're asking the question whether emotions experienced in the initial team meeting matters. A brief background, Professor Gupta is an associate professor in the organizational behavior area at IIMA. Professor Gupta's current areas of research and teaching includes leadership development, motivation, and emotional intelligence, among other things. Professor Gupta currently serves as the president of the Indian Academy of Management, which is an affiliate of the Academy of Management in the US. Needless to say, Professor Gupta is an accomplished scholar and is widely published, more recently in outlets such as the Academy of Management Journal, Human Resource Management, among other outlets. So it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Vishal Gupta today. Before I pass on to Professor Gupta very briefly, today's format is that it'll be a 1 hour approximately seminar where Professor Gupta will first speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take a Q&A, have a 10-minute Q&A session, and then another 20 minutes of talk, and then we'll end with another 10 minutes of Q&A. And as Professor Gupta is speaking, feel free to type in your comments or questions, mainly in the chat box. And we'll keep a note, we'll keep track of all of them, and then we'll take up the questions in those specific Q&A windows. So without further ado, Professor Gupta, over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep, and thank you everybody for joining in. So I'll share a short presentation that I have created on this work. So this is a work that we have recently sort of finished, and it came out. So this is, if you look at the photo on the first slide, this is a very common picture depicting problems with teamwork. And the whole idea of this paper, this research that we did, was to understand how people, especially in geographically dissimilar teams. So basically, what does geographical dissimilarity mean? It means that these are teams which have people, participants or members who belong to different regions. So we did actually two studies in this work. In the first work, we looked at international teams where we had team members coming from different parts of the world. And in the second study, we looked at intranational teams where team members came from different parts within the country, right? So it was international dissimilarity as well as intranational dissimilarity. Now, if you have teams which are dissimilar in terms of geography, the question that we try to look at is who gains influence and what determines whether team members become influential in a team that is diverse, that comprises of dissimilar team members. And specifically, do emotions, that means the kind of feelings people experience during initial team meetings, does that really influence or impact who becomes more influential in these kinds of teams? So that's the broad research question, the kind of framework that we try to explore in this study. So I don't need to elaborate much on this. Teams are basically groups of people having different kinds of skills, perspectives, who are put together to solve a common problem. And they have certain goals, they have certain boundaries, they have obviously interdependencies, and they hold each other to different standards of accountability. So that's a broad definition of teams. And again, needless to say that as our organizations are becoming more and more complex, as organized societies are becoming complex, it is becoming important for managers, management to understand what makes teams work and what makes team members stick together. So that's the context of teams that we look at. Now, there are diverse teams. COVID actually has shown that we all are sitting at different parts of country and the world, but still trying to do things together. Physical work may actually not be possible. And so obviously technology has bridged this divide where people from different parts of, of the world are coming together and working on different, not just COVID, it has been there for long now. So what we, again, as I just mentioned, the broad question, if I have to put the whole research paper in one question, the question is who gains influence in geographically dissimilar teams? That means if you have all these members that you look at, that you are looking at on your screens, if you have these members, who out of these members would actually become influential, why, and what kind of factors would influence people gaining influence in these? Two broad definitions just to sort of help you understand what are we trying to talk about. If you look at in this question, there are two terms. One is geographically dissimilar and the other one is influence. So in the paper, we define geographical dissimilarity as the extent to which a team member differs from all other team members in terms of nationality, that is international dissimilarity, and state, that means international dissimilarity. So if I am a team member having 5 other team members, so we are a team of 6 people, I am a focal team member. How many people in this team are actually belonging to the same geography from which I come from, or the same state that I come from? So that is the definition of similarity. And the influence, the definition of influence, I as a team member, am I able to alter other team members' thoughts, feelings, and behaviors as we engage in the decision making that is happening in the team? So if I have to say that I am an influential team member, can I influence the process that the team is taking, or the process that the team is engaging in to reach to a particular goal? In simple words, do other team members listen to what I am going to say or what I am saying? So if I am influential, I will be heard, and my whatever I am saying would be taken into the kind of decisions that the team is making. So that's the definition of influence. Now, there has been a lot of literature which looks at diversity, dissimilarity, and its impact on people working together. So we looked at two broad, the theoretical framework that we looked at in this, that we built upon in this paper is called as the social identity theory, which says that team members work to to sort of enhance their social personal identity as well as the identity of associating or being associated with the social group. Now, when I go into a team, when I'm a part of a team, I look at people who are dissimilar to me. That means people who belong to different geographies. And so I belong to India, and there may be people from different parts of the world. The tendency, automatic tendency, because geography is something which is very salient and easily discernible, what happens is the immediate process that happens is I tend to classify these other team members as in-group and out. That means people who belong to similar geography, I would tend to classify them as in-group, and people who belong to different geography, they would be classified as out-group. So basically, in-group is a group which I would be I can easily associate with, I can easily work with, whereas an out-group, I am not very comfortable, or I don't really associate myself, I don't really gain my identity out of that group. Now, the sort of past studies and literature says that if I am in a team which has a lot of dissimilar team members, my tendency would be to classify them as outgroup. And when I see that there are lots of people who are there who do not belong to the place or the kind of geography I come from, I may actually spend less effort to work towards the team goal. That means if I have high dissimilarity, the team member may actually spend less effort to achieve team goals. Because, and there have been again documentations, because I don't associate, I don't trust, I have reliability issues, I cannot really associate with them easily. So I end up actually working less towards the team goal if there is high dissimilarity, because I have already classified them as out. And this, I may actually come up with fewer ideas, I may actually not speak much, and obviously therefore other team members would sort of see me as less influential in the team. So that's the kind of one strand of work that looks at diversity and how it impacts team. However, there is a very right after social identity theory, there was an offshoot from the same theory, which was called as social categorization theory, which said that yes, it is true that I may classify people as in-group and out-group, but I may actually not look at just geography as the criterion for classifying or categorizing people as outgroup. Rather, I may actually want to derive certain positive qualities. So what classifies people as outgroup would depend on whether I am willing to gain certain positive qualities from that particular group. So what does categorization theory say? It says that in a dissimilar team, that those team members are there because they are all bringing in some new perspective. They are all, this team has been created because they with the aim that there would be new perspectives, new ideas coming from different parts. So I would actually start believing that these dissimilar team members are actually more useful because they help us achieve the team goal much better than what the similar team members would sort of lead to. And therefore, I don't associate myself just based on geography. Rather, I associate based on people having certain qualities, such as whatever A, B, C, different qualities that this group may bring in. And therefore, I may not categorize these dissimilar team members as outgroup, but actually as in-group, because my categorization tells me that there is something positive to learn from these dissimilar team members. And therefore, I may end up focusing more on positives and different perspectives that are brought in by dissimilar team members, and end up actually categorizing them as in-group and not outgroup. And therefore, this second argument may actually help me to spend more effort in achieving team goals, and therefore putting in more efforts in influencing the other team members and the team process. So there is one strand of work in the literature which documents that dissimilarity may impact negatively how members react to diversity and dissimilarity, whereas there is also another argument which says that dissimilarity can actually help and people can actually exert more influence when you have dissimilar team members. So therefore, the broad question that we started with was dissimilarity, if it can have both positive and negative in effects on member influences, then what would be those boundary conditions that would actually help us understand when will dissimilarity lead to positive influence and when would dissimilarity lead to negative influence. So that was the broad dilemma, the broad question that we wanted to examine. And what we looked at and what we sort of the idea that we tried to explore was, what is the role of emotions, what is the role of transient feelings, transient emotions that people experience during team meetings that actually determines whether you would take the social identity route and classify dissimilar team members as outgroup, or whether you would take the categorization, social categorization theory route and classify dissimilar team members as in-group and work towards exerting influence. So what are the roles, what is the role of different emotions that come up during team meetings in determining the impact of dissimilarity on influence? So let me just give you very quickly what is emotion. Well, emotion is said as energy in motion, intense, short-lived, affective reactions to events. They could be based on memory, they could be based on past events, they could also be dependent on what is happening in the present time. So basically, we are emotional beings, we all keep feeling certain things. There are certain feelings that we associate with, which could be based on past, present, or even just memory. Emotions, they affect decision making even in long term. There has been quite some bit of work which has demonstrated that emotions, though they are transient and short lived, the emotions that we experience can actually keep impacting how we react even at later time and in the long term. Very popular study, Andreid and Ariely, 2009, they induce certain emotions in study one, and then they sort of got the participants to engage in filler activities for some time, and then after some time they did a study 4 in which they actually saw that the emotions that people experienced in study 1, not in study 2 or 3 recent studies, they are actually determining the outcomes that the kind of decisions people are making even in study 4, which happens later. Again, there have been studies where people have been given information on political candidates and have been asked to rate those candidates a week later. And it has been found, Otati and Isbell, they found that what feelings people had during that information session actually impacted how people rated the candidate a week later. So there is some evidence which says that emotions impact decisions in the long term. And we hypothesize that emotions that team members experience during their initial meetings, their initial team meeting, impact what relationship will exist between dissimilarity and perceived influence. We had two reasons for this. One is there has been again a very popular model which says that teams actually go through long periods of inertia. We meet in the first teams meet, uh, and then there is a big lull in activity of the team, and only sometime post the midpoint is when the teams actually start to become active again and engage in action. So teams actually go through long periods of inertia, inactivity, and also uh, because there is limited less interactions over long periods of time, the initial interactions create a big impact on how people think about each other and the kind of interactions that they will have over a period of time. So we looked at, there are many emotions. We broadly looked at three categories of emotions in our work. This is a model of emotions given by Russell and Barrett in 1999, which says that emotions can be actually divided on two dimensions: high activation and low activation, which is activation and deactivation, and pleasant and unpleasant. So you basically, there are four categories that will form out of this chart. You have pleasant and unpleasant high activation emotions, and both of these emotions have been associated with creativity, arousal, engagement. So even so, if you have pleasant and high activation emotions, you basically are in the happiness domain, and you would tend to engage with other team members much more. There is arousal and you would like to work with other team members. If there is unpleasant high activation emotion, which is basically the top left, which is you are largely driven by anger or maybe fear, there also it has been found that people have a tendency to gain control in these situations. So if you are in a team, you would actually work more to, but in an abrasive manner, in not a happy manner. You would actually try to work and control the situation or overpower the other team members in that kind of setting. Unpleasant low activation, largely driven by sadness, which is the bottom left quadrant, which is driven by sadness. But again, there have been studies which have shown that Didrew and George Zhao, they have documented that when people are sad, that is unpleasant but low activation, you actually engage in much more thoughtful and systematic analysis of information. So while you are sad, you would tend to look at what is wrong in the situation, and if there is something that we can look at. I can do to sort of improve the situation and engage in certain kinds of processes to improve the situation. Whereas pleasant low activation, which is calm and relaxed, there has been no studies which have actually documented that they are related. This fourth quadrant is related to either creativity or social engagement. And so on. So what we did was, in this study, we looked at three broad classifications. We looked at pleasant high activation emotion, unpleasant high activation, and unpleasant low activation emotion, and sort of theorized what would be their roles when we are determining or when we are looking at the relationship between dissimilarity and influence. So I'll just quickly go through the three hypotheses that we presented in the paper. The first one, which is pleasant high activation emotion, driven largely or classified largely as happiness, which says that when people have high activation, pleasant emotions, they are much more flexible, they are much more open to look at positive qualities of dissimilar teammates. So if you have happy emotions, then your tendency to classify dissimilar teammates as in group will be much more. You would be much more willing to understand what are the positives that these different people are bringing into the team, and you would end up being more inclusive and be more willing to work with. And therefore, we theorize that when there is geographical dissimilarity, it would be positively related to team members' influence. Because you are more inclusive, you would be interested in putting in more efforts, and therefore be looked at as more influencing in the team project for team members who experience high rather than low levels of pleasant high activation emotions in their initial team meeting. That means when you first met, the kind of, if you have experienced pleasant high activation emotion, you would be much more willing to exert influence in those or exert effort, and therefore be seen as more influencing by other team members in the team process. The second, which is unpleasant high activation emotion, you can see in the picture there are people who are sort of engaging in maybe little fights in the team. So they also lead to an urge to act. As I mentioned, it is high activation. That means you want to act in to overcome or to sort of manage this emotion, and you would be largely driven by a tendency to control, largely driven by a tendency to bring other team members under your influence, and therefore you would be willing to act more during maybe impulsively, maybe just because of your tendency to control that present situation, and therefore you would spend more time to impact the team decision making. However, if you look at this emotion, unpleasant high activation emotion, over time, this would also lead to depletion of cognitive resources. It would lead to abrasive behavior. It would lead to stereotyping. So what would happen is, while initially you may be seen as maybe more dominating, maybe more influencing, over time, because there is so much of abrasiveness that has happened in the team, over time this influence may actually go down. So what the second hypothesis that we theorized in the paper was that geographical dissimilarity would be positively related to perceived influence at an early time of the team working, whereas negatively related to the influence at a later time. People will see you to be more influential at an early time, but because of the abrasiveness that this emotion is going to bring in, the efforts would go down, or other things may happen, and the influence will go down. The third, which is sadness, frustration, uh, there has been work which has shown that this can actually, in a team setting, this can lead to people engaging in more thoughtful information processing and understanding what is the problem at hand, and people would look at systematically and persistently working towards fixing the problem through thoughtful analysis. And they would likely to focus on, again, because you have dissimilar team members and there is something wrong that is happening in a team setting. So you may actually want to look at what can I derive out of these dissimilar team members that I have that can help the team's goal and so on. However, this process is going to be slow. It is slow. It is low activation. So it is going to slow. It is going to be slow, and we will be able to see its effect only in the long term and not in the short. And therefore, the third major hypothesis that we had in the paper was geographical dissimilarity would be related to team members' influence, but only at a later time for team members who experience these kinds of unpleasant low activation emotion, rather than people who are not experiencing this emotion. So this was the broad uh, uh, framework. The question was dissimilarity and influence. How are they related, and what are the rules of three broad categories of emotions? Pleasant high activation, unpleasant high activation emotion, and unpleasant low activation emotion. And I'll just quickly take a minute and then I'll stop and I'll present more on the study designs later on. We had two designs, we did two studies. One we did at a college in Hong Kong, where we had international candidates. So we had an opportunity to examine how teams work in international settings where team members are coming from different parts of the world. And in study two, we did study at our college, where we followed student teams over a period of about 4 months. And we looked at how student teams that are comprised of students belonging to different parts of the country, how do they work, and how do they sort of, what kind of effects do we see between the similarity and influence as these teams work? So I'll take a pause here, and we'll see if there are any questions.
So Vishal,
Yeah.
one question from Manohar, if you'd like to take.
Aspect of authority. So if I understand, Manohar, your question, I think authority, you are saying if in these teams anybody had a formal role of being a team leader and therefore having authority over other team members. So actually they were all what we call as self-directed teams. There was nobody who was assigned as a team leader. These are student project teams who are assembled, who are these teams are created to actually work on projects, and there is no one who is actually given a specific title of team leader, and therefore you have higher authority on. So it evolves, and that is actually a part of the influence that we try to measure. Who becomes more influential, and is there any role of dissimilarity in determining that influence? So to answer your question, there was nobody who was given a specific role. So Praveen says, okay, so sibling rivalry. So the sibling rivalry would mean that these are similar teammates. They are not dissimilar uh, uh, teammates. And if you have people who are similar, right? Now, uh, so we actually mentioned in this paper that uh, it may actually, this setting is obviously different. This is not a work setting, but uh, people who are belonging to similar geographies, they may actually be seen as less useful because you are all bringing the same kinds of inputs to the team process. You are all bringing the same kinds of information to the team meetings, and therefore I actually see you as not helpful for whatever work or project that, and therefore similarity actually may actually end up being associated with people exerting less influence, people exerting less effort, because I see that if I have similar team members, then well, my efforts may actually not really help in solving the team. It's not a directly relevant thing, but the categorization process may actually then classify you as an outcome, and which may obviously see as leading to rivalries. So I think Sandeep will go ahead.
Yeah, I think these are the questions that we had, so let's
Yeah.
continue.
Yes. Okay. So I will continue with. Yeah, so this was. So I'll present what we did in the first study. This was done at a college in Hong Kong, as I mentioned. We had teams where we had people from uh, different geographies. We collected data from 48 teams. Team sizes varied from 4 to 5 students. So you had memberships, different teams. And the design in this college was pretty unique. Before their classes started, each all the students actually, they underwent a 5-day residential program, which we in our college we perhaps call it as induction. So they had a 5-day residential program where they actually met as teams and they interacted with each other, understood each other, tried to learn more about their backgrounds and so on. And the program was designed to facilitate teamwork in the long run. So what we did was we uh, measured perceived influence of each team member. That means if I am a team of 5 people, then I will rate about perceived influence for all other 4 members. The second team member would rate perceived influence for the other 4 members, and so on. So it was more like a round robin where each one responded to the influence questions for all other team members. And we measured this perceived influence right after the first 5-day residential program ended. That means they had chance to interact, they had met each other, worked with each other on certain short assignments, and then they rated each other on how much different team members uh, influence the team process. Then, when the coursework started, these teams were given a project worth 50% of final grade on a particular course, which was uh, sort of which had two major components. One, they had to do or participate in a business simulation with the other teams and other teams in the class. And they also had to do a case analysis. They were given a case, they were given some questions, and they had to present a case analysis of an actual company. So the teams worked together for, uh, they have a semester system, not a term system like we have. And we collected the influence, the perceived influence data again right after the midpoint in the semester, where again each team member rated about perceived influence, how much, what is the kind of influence I perceive about the other team members. So that was this is the demographics. We had 67% males, 33% females, and the geographies that were represented: China 30%, US, Canada, India, UK, France, Germany, and others, different parts of Middle East and Australia, and so on. They uh, in terms of work experience, people had full-time employment. They had prior work experience of about 2 to 4 years. So very quickly going through how we measured international dissimilarity. It varied from 0 to 1. Uh, so what we looked at, if I am a member of a team having 5 members, how many people in this team belong to the same geography from which I come? So if there are, let's say, one person who belongs to the same country, then the dissimilarity would be 4 divided by 5, which is going to be 80%. Right? So it ranged from zero point 0.4 to 8, with 80% participants scoring above 0.75 in terms of dissimilarity. If everybody is similar, if everybody comes from the same geography, then it would be uh, uh, 0. If everybody comes from different geography, so it would be 1. So 4 divided by 4 would be 1. How did we measure influence? We had 2 questions which participants, team members rated for every other team member. How much influence does the team member exert over team decisions? And we gave them names of the team members and asked them to rate about each of these team members. Similarly, how much does each team member contribute to overall effectiveness of the team. Again, and then we looked at we aggregated. So we looked at RWG measures. We looked at inter-rater reliability, and we found that we had inter-rater reliability of more than 0.7, and we averaged all teammates evaluations of the first question. Then we averaged the evaluation of the second question, and then we took an average of the two questions to get to the score on perceived influence of the team. This is emotions, the three classes of emotions. It's a standard measure which we now perceived influence. That means my willingness to put in more effort into the team process can be also impacted by my learning goal orientation. That means I am a individual who wants to learn, and therefore even though it is similar or dissimilar doesn't matter, because of my high learning goal orientation, I would want to exert more effort. Task meaningfulness, again, I consider these tasks to be meaningful, and therefore I would exert more effort. My values on learning, my team identification, dissimilarity of, so we control for these possible confounding variables which could actually impact my the kind of efforts that I am putting in. So we also measured how dissimilar are team members on education, number of years employed, functional backgrounds, what kind of industries do they belong to, gender, attitude towards teamwork, and so we wanted to sort of rule out other possible explanations of why this kind of effects would happen, and we performed the multi-level analysis to test this. So I'll just quickly show you the results of the paper. So we measured impact of international dissimilarity on perceived influence. As I mentioned, we measured influence right after the first team meeting, the first exercise, and then at a later time, which was midpoint into the semester of the course. We controlled for these, or as I mentioned, these possible confounding variables. And then we had these interaction terms to look at the moderation effects. ID stands for international dissimilarity, and PHE stands for pleasant high activation emotion. We saw a positive impact right after at an early time in the team meeting. ID and UHE, that is unpleasant high activation emotion, which was positive uh, uh, at an initial time, but it was, remember, we had hypothesized that it would be negative at a later time. We saw it becoming insignificant, non-significant, but not negative. And third, which was unpleasant low activation emotion, it was not significant at an initial time, but later on we saw that it became positive and had a positive impact on perceived influence. So we plotted these effects, and just to give a better visualization of our results, and we saw that if you see as the team members experience high positive high activation emotions, as the dissimilarity increases, the perceived influence also goes up. That means in dissimilar teams, if there is high dissimilarity, then if team members experience positive high activation emotions in the initial team meetings, you may have a positive relationship with influence. If we look at the second hypothesis for high activation unpleasant emotions, again, as teams are high on dissimilarity, perceived influence is high at an initial time. That means, because remember we had mentioned that there would be tendency to exert more effort uh, uh, control, uh, sort of exert influence on other team members, maybe exert control, try to control the environment and so on. So it was positive in the initial time, but it was non-significant at a later time. The third, when you have unpleasant low activation emotion with high dissimilarity, we see that the perceived influence at a later time goes up uh, uh, as compared to low, unpleasant low activation emotions. So what did we find? We sort of observed that high activation emotion would moderate the relationship between dissimilarity and perceived influence. Unpleasant high activation emotion moderates the relationship, but only at time 1 and not time 2. And the impact of dissimilarity on influence would be moderated by unpleasant low emotions at time. So we, given this, we wanted to see if the same, what kind of effects would happen when there is intranational dissimilarity, and if there is an impact of emotions in these relationships. So we collected data from 75 teams at a college ranging from 5 to 7 students. Uh, they were worked on together as teams. They had 30% component in the final grade, which was based on the group assignment, which was they had to again do an analysis of an actual company, make a presentation as well as a now, unlike study one, we did not have a focused program which was dedicated where you would have as a part of a design teams coming together at an initial time and engaging in certain activities. So we did not have possibility to measure perceived influence right after their initial team meeting. So what we did was we measured perceived influence after at 2 time points again, but just past midpoint of the first term and then at the end of uh, the term. So we call this as not T1 and T2, but T2 and T3. T2 was similar to the T2 of study 1, which was midpoint after some time has elapsed. And then time 3, which was actually when they have spent full 3 months working on together as a team, at least knowing each other and working on the group. We had similar demographics in terms of males and females, and we had 23 out of 36 states and UTs represented, AP 16, and we are quite familiar. We have a representative group. The full-time employment was, we have a lot of freshers, and so the mean was about 1.2 years. International dissimilarity was again measured similar way as international dissimilarity. How many other team members belong to the same state or union territory to which I belong? So that sort of gave us an index of intranational dissimilarity. Influence was measured in the same way, emotions again. And again, we controlled for different variables. We even controlled for overlap in languages spoken. So as we know, you people can know different languages. So how many can you converse in at least one language? So that means if there is any overlap in the languages that people speak, we also wanted to check if the kind of results that we are seeing is that because of transient emotions or actually trait emotions. That means you have a tendency, it's part of your personality to experience these kinds of emotions. And therefore we control for trait emotions and also interaction between emotions, these trait emotions and international dissimilarity, and then again dissimilarity on different demographics such as education, years employed, and so on. So we got this result when we did the analysis for international dissimilarity and perceived influence. We had all these uh, variables. We had also trait measures, and we had the interaction of trait, emotions, and intranational dissimilarity. And so very quickly, we saw that intranational dissimilarity, again, we saw positive impact at an early time. Unpleasant high activation emotion, we saw that it would be negatively related both at time 2 as well as time t. Remember, we had said that over time, this emotion will lead to negativity and negative relationship. And unpleasant low activation emotion, it had consistently positive effect at both time 2 and time 3. So we again plotted, and the results were uh, if you have high pleasant or high activation emotions, your perceived influence goes up as the intranational dissimilarity is increasing. As you have unpleasant high activation emotion, influence goes down with dissimilar teams. Similarly, at time 3, again influence goes down with dissimilar teams. And when you have unpleasant low activation emotion, the perceived influence goes up at time 2 as well as time 3. So this was the results of the second study. Broadly coming to what are the major findings or implications that we can take away from this work. I think if I have to again summarize the whole exercise in one statement, it would be this: that the emotions experienced in the initial project meetings in dissimilar teams, our study shows that they have a possibility to shape team members' influence over the life of a project. People who experience high activation emotions, they are likely to be seen as influential at an early time of the team meetings. People who experience unpleasant high activation emotions, they may gain early influence, but that influence goes down because of continuing abrasive behavior and high levels of cognitive depletion. People who are experiencing or who have experienced unpleasant low activation emotions, well, there is a possibility that they may be seen as influential, but the effects will be seen over a period of time, not immediately. So this positive relationship will exhibit only at later stages of team meetings. So implications for managers, I think what is important for management and managers is to understand that dissimilar teams can actually lead to both high effort or high perceived influence as well as low effort and low perceived influence. So what is important is people should understand the category and the intensity of emotions that team members are experiencing, and that can have an impact on how we engage in categorization processes or how we look at dissimilar team members. So what is important is, I'll go to this slide, that managers understand that initial team meetings have an important role to play in shaping emerging influence among dissimilar team members, and they can plan interventions accordingly. They sort of initial team interactions, they should be thought about carefully and should be designed to elicit pleasant high activation emotions, so that the memory of these emotions sort of is there, and people are sort of reminded of this positivity as they uh, go through their team processes. People who experience unpleasant low activation emotions during initial team meetings, it is important for team members to facilitate their access to information, their access to team decision making processes, so that they can actually engage in more systematic and thoughtful processing and can actually help been leading to better putting in more effort and more influence as the teams progress on their goals. And the last, which is if managers see that there are people who are experiencing unpleasant high activation emotions, I think that is what is where managers need to intervene and need to talk about controlling their abrasive energy, their energy, and channelizing them to sort of more creative activities rather than that abrasiveness leading to uh, sort of lesser efforts and lesser influence. Alternatively, I think what this is something that uh, we all talk about a lot. I think it is important for organizations and individuals to think about how to become more emotionally intelligent, and organizations to think about developing certain training programs, at least sensitizing their employees and individuals about different classes of emotions and the kinds of impacts these emotions can have in the team processes and team function. Well, there are a few limitations. Obviously, the study was based on MBA student groups, though we still consider that MBA groups are good in terms of conducting this kind of study, because you get a good representation of geographies given the two groups that we had, and they also work in some meaningful projects, but there is a need to see if these kinds of results would generalize to work settings. We did consider that influence is positive, influence is good, and people will like to exert influence in team processes. However, individual influences can also be detrimental and need to be carefully avoided. So, but we, in our definition, we looked at influence as something more desirable and therefore should be promoted and encouraged in team. We did not look at the fourth class of emotions, which is pleasant low activation emotions. There is literature, we banged on that literature which mentioned that this class of emotion may not necessarily be useful in team processes. And yeah, we did not have opportunity to collect team influence right after, perceived influence right after at team one, which was equivalent to the Hong Kong study. So that was. So I think we'll stop here and we'll take up questions.
Yeah, thanks, Vishal. We have at least 3 questions. So Manohar is asking if you could spend some more time. I think he's referring to study 2 results.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Manohar, this is perceived influence that we measured at the end of term for the Indian groups, the Indian teams. That means the teams had worked for full term on the project. And at the end of the term, when the term had ended, we went to those team members and asked them, what is your perception about the influence of each of your team members? So people rated each member on the team influence. So what we are showing here is that unpleasant high activation, that means the anger, the fear, those kinds of emotions, over time, that means the teams have worked for a long period of time. In dissimilar teams, the perceived influence is actually low, which is what we were mentioning early on, that because of the high negativity that this emotion brings in, the teams will perceive that focal team member who is experiencing that emotion to be less influential for the team process, less useful for the team goal, for the team effectiveness. And that is what we are showing, that as you experience high UHE, the plot is negatively slow. Yeah.
So Harshit,
Yes.
on
So
autonomy.
so again, autonomy, need of other team members. So Harshit, if I understand, you are saying that the team members want that there should be some leader in the group. Well, it may be possible, but again, as I mentioned, we sort of uh, uh, assume that because these are equally capable team members, right? Even if there is uh, and they have a common purpose, common goal to solve the team issue, the uh, issue that they have. Maybe it may not impact so much, though we have not obviously controlled for autonomy need. But my sense is that first of all, it may not be very high because you don't want uh, uh, anybody to become a sort of leader. You are all having similar autonomy needs, and it may work in that manner. So that kind of, and we did have some proxy measures in terms of dissimilarity, in terms of your work experience, your uh, work background, your education background, which may also be seen as proxies to autonomy.
So, Smita has a question on whether any particular nationality you found, whether you found any particular nationality to have higher influence than others, and whether there are some broad qualities or traits associated with those nationalities.
Uh, we did not do specific to nationality. This was more at the team level, but that's an interesting question to look at. Uh, uh, I don't have a ready answer to this. If there is any particular geography that uh, came out. Basically, you see, geographical dissimilarity uh, is is a relative measure in terms of whether I am different from other members in terms of geography. So it is not specific to whether one geography uh, is. So we did not do that geography-wise analysis. We had this relative measure of 0 to 1, and that is what we.
So, Nidhi Ahuja
Yes, yes.
asks whether there is any leadership framework that can be used as reference. Could you suggest some?
Uh, which comes or is. Yes, so you see, there is one study that comes to my mind immediately. Is this is uh, a work that was actually done by Google and on their teams. Uh, so Google did a project called as Project Aristotle, where they followed their teams over a long period of time, and they wanted to understand what makes certain teams effective at Google and what makes certain teams ineffective at Google. And they found from their analysis that there were uh, two sort of characteristics that were common for effective teams. The first one they called as psychological safety. Psychological safety. That means uh, I, as a team member, I feel that it is psychologically safe for me to speak up in my team members. That means the other team members are sensitive to my feelings, which is again the emotional bit. They are sensitive to the kind of emotion I am experiencing, and therefore they will be they are willing to give. They are more empathetic. They are willing to listen to me more. They are willing to give me more time to sort of voice my opinion. So I find it to be psychologically safe to speak in those or contribute in those teams. And the second quality that they found, which was common across teams, was what they called as conversational turn taking. What does this mean? They saw that in effective teams, every team member contributed for almost the same time. That means every team member had spoken almost about equal amount of time. It was those team meetings were not dominated by one person, though they had uh, members who were participating. So I think that is a good framework that people should sort of keep in mind when you are working in teams. The leadership framework, well, uh, I think there is some work on emotional intelligence and leadership, that people should be empathetic, leaders should be empathetic, leaders should try and understand others' feelings. So I think that is something that we can keep in mind. There's an article called by Daniel Goleman, "What Makes a Leader." That may be a good place to start.
So Vishal, take one last
Yes.
question.
Okay.
It's, essentially, it addresses two questions possibly, which
Yeah.
is related to how this study would be different in virtual settings or in virtual team settings. In both, I think there are two questions: one related to working environment or
Yeah.
workplace environment, and then also in classes or academic environment.
No, I think that's a very valid question. That is a question that we also have in mind. What would be the impact of these kinds of these results when you have virtual settings? My preliminary guess is the broad effects that we have seen would not be very different, because even through technology it is possible to the kinds of meetings that you have, you uh, you do experience emotions, you do experience uh, these kinds of uh, uh, feelings, but again it has to be tested, it has to be examined. uh, it would also depend upon how much the teams use technology to really not just talk about work issues, but also to understand each other's feelings, and how well management or managers or team members use technology to elicit and manage, address the kinds of emotions that we talk. So, so yeah, it's not a simple answer. I don't have an answer. It needs to be tested. But if you can use the technology well, my guess is it would not be very different.
Okay, so thank you so much, Vishal, for your time and for this really insightful talk. I'm sure that a lot of participants have benefited from attending this talk. So thanks so much, and thanks to all everybody else for attending this seminar. So thanks so much, Vishal.
Thank you. Thank you.
Typically, in a physical setting, we would definitely have offered you a memento, but there's something we can't do in this
No,
environment.
no. We can use the
Thanks so much.
technology. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.